And I would argue that our next speaker is one of the most highly anticipated guests of this Future Forum this year. He has followed the evolution of the resilience of Nordic and Baltic societies for a long time from very special vantage points and positions as Foreign Minister of Estonia, as a member of the European Parliament, and as the fourth President of Estonia. He acted as a president from 2006 to 2016. And after the presidency, he has, among other things, focused on international politics, technology, security, and geopolitical issues. But how to harness technological capabilities without falling victim to geopolitical crossfire, that's the headline. Tough nut to crack. But dear audience, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome former President of Estonia, Mr. Toomas Hendrik Ilves.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be back in Finland. I don't know if Finland's glad that I am, but anyway. But anyway, today on the 19th anniversary of the deposition of ratification protocols in Washington and thus Estonia's official accession to NATO, namely today, 19 years ago, I am especially pleased and satisfied to congratulate Finland on its impending accession to our common family. NATO is a defense organization of shared values and, more importantly, common interests in preserving liberty and democracy in the transatlantic area. While many, through the last 30 years, thought that NATO was obsolete, I won't mention names, the last year has proven to the last doubters what we in Estonia have known for years. The defense of liberty and democracy never ends, either at home or abroad. As Immanuel Kant argued 230 years ago in his Perpetual Peace, war can be eliminated only when we have a federation of republics, which in modern terms means liberal democracies. But until everyone is a liberal democracy, the possibility of war will remain. So, ladies and gentlemen, war, be it between tribes, nations, or nation-states, has always been a matter of numerical and technological advantage. If you want to win, there have to be more of you, or you need better weapons, which effectively increase one side's numerical advantage, or you need, as in the case of the Soviet Union fighting Nazi Germany or Finland, to be willing to have enough in Ukraine today, you need to have enough of your own die simply to swamp the technologically superior adversary with numbers. Technology changes conflict, war, and so too, obviously, security. From simple hand-to-hand conflict to rocks to weapons of stone, leading to bronze spears to iron technological developments, give an advantage to those who possess them. The bow, the English longbow, stirrups, armor, gunpowder, all have changed the nature of conflict and consequently history. So to put it briefly, we have to follow tech if we are going to be secure. But things have changed in tech. Briefly, the primary unit of war has always been force, the definition of which we all, I assume, learned in high school as Newton's second law of physics. Force equals mass times acceleration, and this is always applied to war. That is, that acceleration is how quickly things speed up, plus mass. We know this as kinetic force. All use of force from prehistory until the end of the second millennium almost exclusively, has been kinetic. You can increase force through greater mass, a bigger rock, a bigger bomb, or through increased velocity, a better spear-throwing arm, a bow, a trebuchet, or a hypersonic missile. The problem is that roughly since the beginning of this millennium, we have seen the increasing use of digital force. Digital force has no mass, and within the confines of the Earth at least, distance and time are reduced to trivial figures. So you can use force now in ways that it never occurred to anyone. The nature of war changed dramatically with the development of the computer and its use as a weapon, a profound change that alters the most fundamental assumptions of security and warfare from the previous several million years. This is not to say that kinetic warfare has disappeared, as we know too painfully from Ukraine, yet the use of digital technologies in state-on-state warfare adds a new dimension to security policy that requires us to alter our understanding of aggression, of alliances, of defense, and our responses. Most importantly, given the power of digital weaponry, we can already assume that any serious state-on-state conflict will begin not with a kinetic attack, but through creating paralysis, or at least attempted to create paralysis in, and indeed shutting down the state attack, which, a perfect example is the massive cyber attack that hit Finland soon as the Eduskunta voted to join NATO. It wasn't noticed because Finnish cyber security and resilience was so good. But some other places, well, it would have had some serious effects. So when we think about it, if a war starts, we know, as we saw in Ukraine, electricity grids will be shut down, traffic lights will turn red, water supplies and gas shut off. Essentially, all unprotected infrastructure will be shut down, and that we have seen so little of it in our part of the world is largely due to the fact that it is well protected. And all this can begin before a kinetic attack starts. And we can add that any kinetic military infrastructure that is left functional after an initial shutdown will be subjected to digital electronic attacks of all kinds, which I won't get into, but anyway. All of this in the history of warfare is only as old as the 21st century, and thus has come only recently into security policy thinking. The first panel on cyber issues at the Munich Security Conference, which is the premier security conference, took place in February of 2011, so 11 years ago, and also, I should say, 4 years after my country was shut down by cyber attacks. And of course, doctrine in this area has been even slower to come onto the scene. Nevertheless, there has been no absence of different types of digital warfare in these 20 years. We can distinguish several broad categories or attack vectors in digital warfare. They differ in many ways, where the only common element is the use of digital technology. There is cyber warfare of hacking and spying and the use of logic bombs against other computers and computer-run systems. As we have seen in the last several years of ransomware, data also can simply be locked and made inaccessible. DDoS, or digital denial of service attacks, shut down servers, rendering access impossible to those who depend upon them, which is what happened to us in Estonia in 2007. And this can be banks, newspapers, or any other needed service. And there is also information warfare waged at much higher levels of cognition. Information warfare is aimed at political disruption via social media with false news, artificial social media groups, and disinformation-based conspiracy theories, which is especially prominent these days in the United States. Moreover, these can be used in hybrid form, as was the case in 2016 and 17 when Hillary Clinton's server was hacked by a Russian intelligence service affiliated hacking group, and then Russia supplied its contents to WikiLeaks, which subsequently released them and most likely altered the outcome of the election. The following year, we saw in 2017, during the French presidential election, that Emmanuel Macron's servers were hacked with, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you view him, with little effect, as his own election staff had, quote, seeded the server with obvious fakes that basically eliminated the political effects, because when they were hacked and then published, they were so ridiculous because the hackers had chosen the most obvious things and said, okay, this will really embarrass him, but soon when they didn't realize that when they published it, it was clearly fake from the Macron side. And we can add to this, which is perhaps where I want to ultimately end, is that the threats of the new digital era are often confounded by policymakers who don't get it. For example, Donald Trump talking about the cyber. We have to look now in history how all of this developed, just briefly, not for long. But the computer was first and foremost and remains a tool of espionage. You can penetrate another nation's computer systems, most inner sancta, find their deepest secrets, and no one might ever know. The first publicly known nation-to-nation hack, however, came much later. It was as late as 1999 with a hack now known as Moonlight Maze, which is the U.S. name given to Russian penetration of the U.S. Department of Defense in 1999. Since then, we have seen countless more attacks carried out by most major state actors, either directly or through proxies. Among the biggest, and perhaps better known, is the, quote again, presumably Chinese hack of the Office of Personnel Management in the United States in 2015, where whoever it was stole 23 million personal records of U.S. federal employees, their addresses, their phone numbers, in the case of all CIA agents, their psychological profiles as stored by the CIA. To this day, we don't know who did it, but basically, if you have worked for the U.S. federal government, they know where you are, what you're like, what your problems are. And then, of course, we had the hack of, as I mentioned, Hillary Clinton's emails, which probably altered the elections. The solar winds hack, which was discovered in 2020, in which the Russians gained access, it is thought, to much of the United States digital architecture, as well as the private companies, including defense contractors. So basically, no one is immune to this. More broadly, and important to keep in mind for the idea of cybersecurity, just 2 Russian hacking groups using the American nomenclature, APT and APT-29, those are Advanced Persistent Threats 28 and 29, that's the name given to them, have penetrated the German Bundestag, leading German Stiftungen or think tanks, the U.S. Congress, the U.S. State Department, the Italian and probably Danish foreign ministries, and on top of all that, just to show it's not governmental, even the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, because WADA had information on doping on the part of Russian athletes. So undoubtedly, they have penetrated far more Western governments or agencies, as well as international and non-governmental organizations, but either they don't know they've been penetrated or they're not talking about it. Western governments, moreover, are loath to consider hacking attacks and penetrations as aggression, primarily because Western nations presumably do the same to their adversaries. But the latter don't admit, say the Russians do not admit they have been penetrated. And more importantly, and as we saw in the case of the 2020 solar winds hack, governments will not respond to aggressive counteraction if the hack was simply a matter of theft with no real noticeable damage. And then finally, well, not quite finally, but anyway, a step up from mere espionage are logic bombs. And these are digital forms of sabotage, not merely exfiltration of data. And these do rise to the threshold of war. The 3 best known of these are the Iranian Shamon virus, which disabled about 3,000 of Saudi Arabian oil company Aramco's computer systems. All of them had to be replaced. Secondly, the attack on Ukraine's electrical grid in 2014, which blanked out entire sections of the country. And of course, best known of all, the American-Israeli Stuxnet virus, which took down the Iranian nuclear enrichment plant in a so-called SCADA, Systems Control and Data Acquisition, and that's SCADA systems basically run all of our infrastructure these days, at least here up in the northern part of Europe. Other parts are a little less developed, but anyway, if you live in this part of the world, all of our critical infrastructure is run digitally, in which basically they manipulate feedback information, be it Iranian centrifuges or your water supply. These are nation-state actions, yet, as with hacks, these can be performed by smaller groups. In 2006 in Los Angeles, 2 employees of the city's traffic authority in a labor dispute accessed the automatic traffic surveillance center and shut down the system at key intersections in the overpopulated city. So what they did was they turned all the lights red, which caused a huge traffic jam. Fortunately, they didn't turn all the lights green. And you can imagine what would happen if you turn all of the lights in all directions green in any city. So, and finally, we have distributed denial of service attacks, which we in Estonia tend to glorify the most minor of our international achievements. Sounds like some other countries I know, but I won't mention that. As is to be expected, of course, with small countries. What we fail to recognize, though, is that since 2007, we really should be known as the place where state-on-state cyber war occurred for the first time. Yes, we had seen hacks and other occasional tricks and nuisance operations, but if we take Karl von Clausewitz's classical definition of war as the continuation of policy by other means, this was the first time that digital means were used as a form of aggression, again, by one nation state against another, which was in response to Estonia moving a Soviet-era statue. Estonia was not invaded. It was not attacked kinetically. No one was killed, but Russia managed effectively to shut down the entire country. Media, banks, and the government could barely function. So Estonia had to digitally cut itself off from the world, from the rest of the world, to in fact reboot itself, which is literally what we did. We just shut ourselves off. You couldn't get into Estonia, you couldn't get out, digitally speaking. And then we had to start from scratch, rebooting our system. And of course, the really sad part was that in 2007, we went to NATO and said, look, this is what, and the EU, and we said, this is what's happening. And this is, dangerous. And they didn't understand what we were talking about. I mean, the problem was we were talking to people who couldn't tell the difference between a laptop and a toaster oven, but that was the state of security in NATO and the European Union in 2007. I mean, they understood guns, but not computers. So, as I mentioned, DDoS stands for Distributed Denial of Service, and it refers to bombarding and overloading servers with so many messages that they simply stop responding. And that's what happened. So we just couldn't access things. I won't get into this. All I'm saying is that what happened to us in 2007 was fairly primitive, in that this was at a time when hacked computers were used to do this against us. Today, you can shut down far, far more using IoT devices. There are 500,000 closed-circuit televisions in the city of London alone. If you hack those, you can use that to shut down broad swaths of Europe. And this actually happened in the Mirai attack in 2016, but that was more West Coast Europe, East Coast United States. On top of that, we don't always know who did it. We have the problem of attribution. Who did it? And you can't know immediately. You know, when a missile is fired, you see it on your radio and you see it came from there and we're going to go get them. On a cyber attack, we don't know. We really don't. I mean, you will eventually find out, and in general you eventually do find out, either through deduction or through human intelligence, as was the case of the North Korean attack on Sony, but that was really a result of HUMINT, or human intelligence. And then, of course, adding to all of this is the equally problematic issue of outsourcing by states to non-governmental actors, adding to deniability responsibility. That's what happened largely to us in 2007, but we see this constantly where you see that some Russian hackers have been charged by the United States for doing things against the United States, but they were not doing this as part of the Russian government, but they were independent contractors, kind of like private military company Wagner, but they're not Wagner. So what does this mean for security? Well, first and foremost, it means you no longer need a kinetic war to change policy by other means. Before the digital era, physical possession of territory was, other than buying off the leadership of a country, which of course happens as well, the only way you could win was to possess the territory physically. Basically you do that, many of your own population are killed, GDP plummets, post-war economies are in tatters, and of course you run the risk, in the case of attacking NATO, of a nuclear war that will destroy your own company. If you win in a conventional non-nuclear war, you will have to pay forever for the cost of occupation in a hostile, resentful population, as both Nazi Germany and the USSR discovered. But instead of invading a NATO country and risking, via Article 5, a war with the forces of NATO, an adversary nation instead changes a government, using finances, disinformation, and hacking confidential information to alter a democratic election to elect an anti-NATO, anti-EU party or presidential candidate. We kind of have seen this twice in France. I mean, it didn't work, but money, hacks, all of that to make sure that there would be a non-NATO president in France, and you never know where else it's been tried. We've seen this actually happen on a smaller scale through social media disinformation. In 2015, the first time ever that an EU country did something as silly as holding a referendum on an association agreement from the EU to a country, which was the association agreement for Ukraine. All stops were pulled out with disinformation, hacking, and with other things to get the Netherlands to vote no on giving Ukraine an association agreement, which is basically an association agreement. We had one from the early 90s. It doesn't mean anything. It basically means it means a free trade agreement plus student and teacher exchange. I mean, it's not membership, but anyway, they did it. This worked even better, we know, though the British government won't report it or won't release the report, but in the case of the Brexit referendum, there was massive interference by Russia in social media and in other means, and the British government has a report on this, but it's apparently too embarrassing because they won't release it. We know in the case that's, in fact, came out in 2020, it was the UK's Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee, but we don't know what's in there. We know the Russian case of lending money to Marine Le Pen, 9 million euros. We know the case of Hillary Clinton. Most recently, which is what we know fairly well, was that there was an all-out attack on the German Green Party last year, and year before last, and its leader Annalena Baerbock. So, in the immortal words of Vladimir Lenin, "Что делать?" What do we do, or what is to be done? what is important to realize is security, and this is really the basis of all of what I'm saying, is no longer a matter of a strong kinetic military. Yes, you can have 250,000 reservists in Finland ready to defend the border, but if they take everything down, it's not going to help. You can't fight an invading army with memes, but when adversaries come to rely on different weapons, you do need to greatly expand the notion of what security is. And currently, we are facing a number of problems in dealing with these issues. The most significant problem is the lack of understanding among policymakers, especially security policymakers, of the importance of digital threats. True, in our region, there's a little more of an awareness, but nonetheless. We face two broad problems. We lack interdisciplinary, interagency cooperation, and we have national silos that, affect feeble or lead to feeble international multilateral information sharing. Clearly, when foreign ministries, parliaments, think tanks, candidates in election, even the World Anti-Doping Agency are all attacked by just one of two Russian hacking groups, we have to rethink how these things work. We are used to one country being attacked and then sort of maybe telling some other countries about something, but not very much. But now we have, as I mentioned in the beginning, the US State Department, the German Bundestag, you can attack all of these places. There's only two groups that are doing it. They don't care about national borders. We do care about national borders and don't tell anyone else what's been happening, or rarely do. As I said, it's partly explained by the espionage or signal intelligence background of those who deal with hacking, but we see it today live with the Five Eyes, which is the one and the only organization that actually shares information, and it's not even NATO, it is the New Zealand, Australia, UK, Canada, and the United States. Basically the Anglo-Saxons do communicate on signal intelligence matters, but no European country does anymore now that the UK is out. And we don't share this kind of information. The worst case, and I'm told it's gotten better, but in 2011, Estonia discovered in its military network a Russian worm. And so, being good little happy Estonians, we go, gee, hello, NATO, we discovered a Russian worm. And the answer from NATO was, oh, you too. Wrong answer. And this, if you're going to join NATO soon, is something that you will have to, I hope, assist us in making NATO think a little differently. So, and when we think about what are the liberal democracies that are technologically developed, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan are not in NATO. They're not in anything of those things. Yet our threats, as I mentioned, are no longer kinetic, so distance doesn't matter. Time doesn't matter. As I love to say, Tallinn, I'll add here for the Finland, Tallinn, Tampere, Tokyo, Topeka, Kansas, Toronto, and Torino are all equidistant in the cyber era. Just think of that. From Tampere to Tokyo, from Tallinn to Tokyo, or Topeka, they're all equidistant, which is completely different from what kinetic war was about, which in some sense means that NATO is kind of irrelevant, because NATO was created, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Why is it the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? Because of troop logistics, tank transport, fighter plane refueling problems, because they can't fly too long, they have to build a land. So it's all geographically based. NATO is a geographic organization. It is a geopolitical organization. Cyber doesn't care about that. It's all out there. But even within NATO, we have problems with silos. We have, in Tallinn, as a result of the cyber attacks we had in 2007, they finally said, okay, maybe those little Estonians know something, but we have the NATO Center of Excellence for Cyber Defense. In Riga, which is another victim of all kinds of Soviet stuff, mainly disinformation, they have the Center of Excellence for Strategic Communications. Now, the problem is with our silos is that when I raise the issue of deep fakes and what that might mean, I went to the Cyber Center in Tallinn. I said, well, what is this going to mean? And they said, we don't deal with that. That's content. We just deal with the technical side of things. So I went to Riga and I said, well, what are we doing in NATO about deep fakes? They said, not our problem. We don't deal with the technical side of stuff. Which is, I mean, it's all AI based, right? So we're going to have to, I mean, if you continue the logic, we're going to have a Center of Excellence for AI applications and so on. It's not working. So we have to rethink how we do cybersecurity. And of course, compounding all of this, but this is what it will lead to. Oh, I should talk about the EU. I mean, we do have PESCO, which is the Permanent Structured Cooperation, which is a kind of parallel NATO structure that doesn't really work. That's why you're joining NATO. We have, the EU has ENISA, which is the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, which was created to deal with these issues, but it's underfunded. Oh, I don't have much time, do I? Okay. I'll be fast. I'll be fast.
Distances.
I'll be fast. Okay.
Very fast. Thank you.
Well, give me a little time. All right. Okay, so I'll just leave all this crap. Basically, when neither of the premier institutions dealing with cybersecurity are operating or really are dealing with the issues, yet here in Northern Europe, in the Nordic countries and the Baltic countries, we have the leading countries to deal with anything digital. We know that. This is what this whole conference has been about that. So what we need to do is that we have to take charge. Sorry, but we do. Because the way things are going with digital in the rest of Europe, it's kind of, I see it as an attempt to become Argentina. Someone mentioned Argentina before. I'll say the same thing. It's to become, you're not going to innovate by becoming protectionist, which is basically what the Digital Market Act does. So here, living in the Nordic area, we have to take charge. Where our strength also is in economic integration, where our banks, our industries, in fact, our tech, is all kind of integrated. Estonia is where it is because of the strong integration with the Nordic countries. And it works vice versa. Finland has took already 10 years ago over for its Palveluväylä, is actually based on, is the Estonian creation of the X road. I mean, that's the kind of integration that we have at the governmental and also at the economic level, which gives us interoperable digital prescriptions, for example, which I proposed to President Niinistö 10 years ago, and it took a long time to take effect, but not technically. It was all political. That's the other problem. These are political decisions. All kinds of cybersecurity, integration kinds of approaches require political agreement. And that is not happening. And more on top of that, ministries of defense are especially loath to talk about cybersecurity, which in most countries, cybersecurity is dealt with by the Ministry of Defense, and the best cooperation are in countries where it's in civilian hands, such as in Estonia and Finland, which is just more sort of like, I don't know, that's more of a compliment. So, now if we think about cyber, I'll be done in a moment. It's important that we not be hindered by the slowness of the weakest links. By those areas where awareness of cyber issues and digital issues lags behind the sophistication that we have over the last 20, 30 years developed. And where our integration is much stronger. On top of which, we actually do have a critical advantage that we can exploit in this era, which was actually one of the reasons why I proposed the Tiger Leap in Estonia 30 years ago, which was I read a neo-Marxist, neo-Luddite book by Jeremy Rifkin called The End of Work, where he talks about how a steel company was bought by the Japanese. It used to employ 12,000 employees. Japanese automated, digitized it, and then they employed only 120 employees, a 100-fold reduction in staff. I thought this was the greatest thing in the world because our national anxiety has always been about being too small. I mean, the other one is Russia, but same thing. So anyway, so I looked at this, and that's one of the reasons why I proposed digitizing Estonia. It is our great existential angst that we could overcome, and the same applies to cybersecurity, and also, I might add, cyber weapons. Mass and numbers have lost their meaning. We are still small, but we can be much bigger in this digital world. So to tie everything together, if we want to develop cyber resilience, we should rely on what we do best in Europe: innovation. This will require both public and private sectors, and indeed our governments will respond, unfortunately, very oftentimes, only when the private sector, also the sector most affected by cyber attacks, pushes governments to integrate our cybersecurity efforts to take the lead in a digitally sluggish and areas which tends to be digitally sluggish and technologically conservative. So let us strive for security in Northern Europe, in the area where everyone is most vulnerable, especially now that you are going to be in NATO with us. So in closing, technology changes conflict, war, and so too, obviously, security. From weapons of stone to bronze to iron, technological developments give an advantage to those who have them. And so too, we have a certain advantage in this regard. Just as gunpowder made medieval castles useless, now it's time for the Nordic-Baltic region to focus on our strategic advantage. So today much of the West as a whole continues to build, or at least plans to build, castles in the air that are not so grounded in reality, while our adversaries are busy producing ever better gunpowder. So let's stay ahead of all of them. The key is in our hands, and the key, I argued throughout this, is in Nordic and Baltic integration of our cybersecurity. Thank you very much.